I'm going to introduce the moderator for this panel. Samuel Helfont is an adjunct scholar at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He's the author of Yusuf al-Qaradawi, Islam and Modernity by the Mossadegh Center Press in 2009. He also wrote an FPRI monograph entitled The Sunni Divide, Understanding Politics and Terrorism in the Arab Middle East. He is currently a PhD student in the Department of Near East Studies at Princeton University. He's also, at this time, a Naval Reserve Intelligence Officer and is a Operation Iraqi Freedom veteran, correct? Yeah. Okay, Sam.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to FPRI for putting this together. I'm sure I speak on behalf of all the panelists in saying that. We have a very experienced set of panelists and a very interesting paper today on the al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb, which is North Africa, as I'm sure everyone knows. Peter Pham will be presenting the paper. He is a senior vice president of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, as well as an associate professor of justice, political science, and African studies at James Madison University. He primarily studies international relations, strategic issues, and U.S. foreign and defense policy. He's the author of over 300 essays and reviews, and the author, editor, and translator of over a dozen books. Commenting on his paper today, we have Lianne Kennedy Boudali from RAND Corporation. She is an international policy analyst, and she conducts research on terrorism, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and security cooperation. Then we have Professor John Entelis from Fordham University. He's the director of the Middle East Studies program at Fordham. He received his PhD from NYU and has studied Arabic in Cairo, Harvard, and Princeton. He's also been awarded several Fulbrights throughout the Middle East and published extensively on various Middle Eastern issues. You can read about it in his bio. And finally, we have Dr. Audra Grant, also from RAND Corporation. She's a political scientist whose current research is on climate change, displacement in Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, Yemen, and Syria. In 2008, Dr. Grant was based in Iraq as an advisor for the multinational forces on Iraqi elections. And prior to joining RAND in 2004, she was an intelligence analyst for U.S. State Department. I'm sure we will all benefit from both the paper and the comments.
Thank you, Samuel, for the introduction, and thank the Foreign Policy Research Institute for the invitation to be here, and the distinguished panelists for joining me on the stage and offering their comments and suggestions, brickbats. I'm not very sensitive, so I'll take them all. What I'm going to do is just, given the time, I think really get to the discussion, which I think is the most fascinating part of this, just kind of summarize and sketch out some of the trajectories that I have in the larger paper. The background, obviously, of al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb is well known. In fact, I think everyone on this panel has written extensively and published, in fact, more than I have on the background of the subject. Certainly, John Entelis on the civil conflict in Algeria, and I know Lianne's I've referenced, in fact, some of her work on the background of the al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, and its predecessors, or precursors, perhaps better said, the armed Islamic group in Algeria, and then the Salafist group for preaching and combat. In a way, in this particular case study, our interest and focus, and if you will, our definitions necessarily of foreign fighter have to shift a little bit to adapt to the particular circumstance. Certainly the immediate precursor of the current incarnation of al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, the GSPC, had relationships with other groups that were inspired by similar Salafi jihadi ideology in the Maghreb, relationships that were built upon both a convergence of interests and facilitated by both ties developed on other battlefronts, such as Afghanistan, and the rather messy tangle of what can be described as logistical support networks that these various groups had in the diaspora. And these other groups included, of course, the Moroccan Islamic Combatant Group, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, the various Tunisian groups, such as Unification and Jihad and others. What was interesting is that the GSPC, even before its formal induction and recognition as the North African franchise of al-Qaeda, was actually active not so much as a recipient of foreign fighters, but for proactively recruiting and sending out not just Algerians, but Moroccans, Tunisians, and other volunteers from the Maghreb to join the al-Qaeda-led insurgency in Iraq. Significant, almost disproportionate number of Maghrebis in the ranks of foreign fighters there. In 2006, the U.S. military announced that approximately 20% of the suicide bombers in Iraq were Algerian, with another 5% each being Moroccan or Tunisian. Now, the Sinjar documents come up with a slightly different proportion, but obviously when a third of the suicide bombers are coming from one specific region, that certainly says something. And however, this was, I guess, the move, the sending of fighters to Iraq was overcame sort of an obstacle. What was interesting was that the GSPC had earlier, 2003, sought to align itself with al-Qaeda and was actually rebuffed. People tend to forget that today, but it was rebuffed because the leadership of al-Qaeda Central had some questions about their commitment to the ideology of the movement, the establishment of this overall caliphate, rather than simply the overthrow of the Algerian and other North African regimes. And it was this sending out of foreign fighters that helped facilitate, if you will, the building of the trust networks. And it led to the recognition by Ayman al-Zawahiri in late 2006, and then in 2007, the announcement by GSPC that it had become al-Qaeda in the land of the Islamic Maghreb. At this point, though, due to a combination of robust counterinsurgency as well as counterterrorism, and I think the military officers in the room recognize the distinction, as well as over the amnesty offers in Algeria, the effective number of members that the GSPC had when it became AQIM have been reduced perhaps from around 4,000 in 2002 to barely 500, probably a little less than that by the time the recognition came. So it was a much reduced group that was there. Now, as a result of these new ties, however, this coincided temporally with, of course, the time of the launch of the surge in Iraq, the Sunni awakening. So life became a little more uncomfortable. So some of these fighters that had been sent out were coming back home. So in a sense, they were coming back. They were the foreign, to use the taxonomy presented by the panel this morning. You're talking about, in a way, coming back as, although they had been trained before they were sent, coming back as foreign trained rather than foreign fighters per se. They did bring a couple of things with them, insofar as new tactics. And this is probably a second moment I identify in my paper. The adaptation of terrorist techniques that are used elsewhere that had not been the case in the conflict in Algeria or elsewhere in the Maghreb. Certainly vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, repeated attacks against high-profile public targets. There was not, interesting enough, if you look at the data sets, not an increase significantly in the number of operations carried out, but a spectacular increase in the casualty rate and the lethality. Also, deployment, use of tactics like near simultaneous or coordinated or successively coordinated attacks. Heavy use of suicide bombing, all of which had not characterized this fight before, began to characterize it. Another thing that, if you will, on the tactical side, the diffusion of videos. highlighting the attacks on various websites. For example, one of the first of the genre to appear after the rebranding, if you will, of the movement as AQIM was a video claiming responsibility that came out in December 2006 for an attack in December 2006 on a bus in Bouchaoui in Algeria, which left one person dead and a number of wounded, including an American and a Briton. This video had Ayman al-Zawahiri doing the introductory presentation before showing the attack. It was the first of the sort that came out. Another new tactic, in a way, although it had been used before, is the question of ransom, kidnappings for ransom. Although this had occurred before, a large group of German and Dutch tourists back in 2003. This has been taken on a new life in this post-rebranding period. I'll get back to that in a moment. What's been perhaps most interesting is now moving to kind of a third moment that I identify has been in the last 24 to 36 months, the fact that even with the rebranding, even with the return of some fighters, the fact is robust action on the part of the Algerian government has largely changed the nature of the campaign. Whereas we had before a guerrilla war, a counterinsurgency, and centered in Kabylia in the north, that's largely been defeated. There are things that still occur, but that's largely been swept up. People have returned the amnesty. The nature of the organization has also changed because of the defeats in the battlefield. It's less the hierarchical structure, and now the former zone commanders have a great deal of autonomy. Much less to the point where some analysts, I don't think I would go as far as these, would actually question whether Abdelmalek Drukdel, the Amir of AQIM, is really still in charge or anything. I wouldn't go that far personally, but certainly he has far less operational control. I'd like to focus really, and this is where fourth kind of part of my paper goes, is looking at, in particular, the Amir of what was Zone 9 of the GSPC and of the al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which covers most of southern, it's the largest as far as geographic territory of the various zones of the movement, covers most of southern Algeria, the wilayas of Awed, Ouargla, Elizi, Tamagasset, and Adrar in the south, most of southern Algeria. The leadership, the Emir there was Mukhtar Belmokhtar, a.k.a. Khaled Abu al-Abbas, the one-eyed fellow, an acquaintance of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi from the time the two spent a year and a half, when he spent a year and a half together in Afghanistan receiving training in the 1990s, both at Kaudan and Jihadwal camps as well as Jalalabad. Belmokhtar, what's been interesting is that although there has been reports and apparent tensions between him and the Emir of AQIM, Drukdel, is that he's increasingly managed to embed himself in the local community. If reports in the Sahelian press are to be credited, he's married 3 wives, one a Arab woman, a Berbice Arab, one a woman from a family in Timbuktu in Mali, and a third wife is a Tuareg, so he's embedded himself personally by marital alliance in the communities down there. But what's been interesting is, in addition to forging these marital alliances, has been the increasing pragmatism, and here we're seeing this in the last, I would say, 18 months. Since 9/11, since the focus on the global war on terror, there's been a lot of talk, speculation in the analytical community about the nexus of crime and terror being the next big thing. Here's one of the few places where I can say we've actually found it, that's happening. Kidnapping for ransom has become a regular part of the activity of this particular Katiba or operational unit of AQIM, and fabulous ransoms they're bringing back. Just go back last year, They kidnapped a Canadian diplomat serving as a UN envoy, Robert Fowler, and he was released in a package deal that was reputedly worth about $5 to $8 million US. The Canadian Prime Minister denies any payment by the Canadian government, but if you look at the track record, it seems the Swiss and German governments overpaid for their civilians, and the Canadian ambassador was thrown in for free. So interpret that as you will. I make no accusations against our northern neighbor, but I just point out that incongruous data. That then led to a very interesting step, which was the kidnapping an ambush, actually. These are not random kidnappings. The ambush the end of last November of 3 Spanish aid workers from Acción Solidaria, a Barcelona-based humanitarian group. It was a carefully planned operation. They were ambushed of their convoy. They were peeled off and they were taken away. What's interesting was in this particular case, because subsequent investigation actually caught the ringleader involved, was not carried out by AQIM itself. They went out and hired an interesting fellow. ABC, the Spanish newspaper, described him as a man of the desert. A guy named Omar Sidahmed Udhama, who, and this is quoting the open source information on it, apparently was a well-trained operative, one-time field grade commander of sorts with this is the allegation, at least in the open source material, with the Polisario Front, retired from that, and had gone into drug smuggling, contraband, and other activities. He was hired, put together a team that carried out this operation. Now, he was caught. Investigation led to him. He was extradited from Mali to Mauritania. The Mauritanians held a trial. A lot of this was, not all the evidence, but a lot of the evidence was aired at the trial. He was condemned to 12 years of hard labor, appealed the sentence, and the sentence was confirmed on an appeal as well as the conviction, but he didn't spend 2 weeks after that in prison because by that time the AQIM had added to its demands for money ransom for the Spanish hostages, his release. So he was released ahead of the Spanish hostages, according to the Spanish press, somewhere between 5 to 8 million euros was paid for the Spanish hostages. They were released. He was seen on television joking with the hostages and inspecting them. There's clips you can go on YouTube and find it. Shortly after that, what's interesting is shortly after that, that payment was made. Another sophisticated operation was carried out, which was the one 2 weeks ago, where another AQIM group went into northern Niger to Arlit and kidnapped 7 foreign nationals, 5 of them French. This was a rather sophisticated operation because they were all there working for the French nuclear group Areva, but they weren't kidnapped in a convoy or an ambush or even at their offices. They were kidnapped from their homes. Very sophisticated operation that would require planning, infiltration, et cetera. And AQIM has claimed responsibility, and of course there's a war in the French government, and there we stand today. But again, what the pattern we're seeing now, alluding to, is this use of outside operatives, which I find very interesting, because now you're no longer, in a way, it's foreign, in a slightly different twist of the definition, foreign to your conflict. These aren't people who are ideologically drawn to your fight. They're simply guns for hire. In the last 10 years of the war on terrorism, we've seen a lot of private contractors serving in various functions. On the counterterrorism side, now we're seeing in this particular theater the interesting phenomena of the terrorists hiring private contractors to carry out tasks. And in a way, it's for the same logic, that people with technical knowledge, operational knowledge, tactical training, knowledge of the terrain. You go back to the failed attempt by the French military to rescue a French hostage, a septuagenarian, poor fellow, Germaneau, in July. To that, what was it that failed, and unfortunately, Monsieur Germaneau was killed by AQIM in retaliation for the failure. But what was interesting was the body count that the French left behind them. It was sort of a grab bag of people who, none of whom fit the traditional profile of an AQIM fighter. 3 Tuaregs, a Moroccan, Mauritanian, and I forget the nationality of the 6th. But again, reaching out, the Tuaregs because of the operational knowledge of the terrain, the others because of their specific skill sets. So that's an interesting, and I would say possibly very dangerous evolution, because if you have the use of personnel with this type of knowledge, what you have is the likelihood that there will be more operations and the greater probability of success, because these people are, if you will, professionals. Just a couple notes on other activities on this crime extremism nexus. The fact that also the protection, the fact that cocaine routes, smuggling routes, and other contraband pass through areas controlled by AQIM. Reports are, as of now, we don't have any reports of AQIM directly dealing in the material. It seems to be that it's levying a tax, if you will, on passage, but certainly deriving income from illicit contraband. I think if that's the case, it's only a matter of time before you accept payment instead of in cash. If the global pattern bears true, then it's only a matter of time before payment is made in kind. And then the open question, pure speculation on my part, whether this then leads to tapping into networks in Europe and other places for the possibility of getting into the distribution. Just an open question. Few questions we need to ask. What is these fabulous ransoms which are being paid with, in my view, unfortunately, great regularity. We don't have as much data on where the money is going. Some of it clearly is being plowed back into the next operation. Where's the rest of it going? There doesn't seem to be any, at least reports yet, of conspicuous consumption on the part of the emir of the zone or other identified members of the Katiba there. So that doesn't seem to be going into conspicuous consumption. Where is it being plowed into? That's an open question. We simply don't have the data, unlike for the Somali pirates, et cetera, where we clearly, you can visit certain Somali towns, as Ken visits there, and who's got the new Mediterranean villa and the new satellite dishes and the new cars and cell phones. We don't know where the money's going. We don't know how far they're willing to go. They've so far been willing to accept using operators who are not part of the group to carry out operations. Are they also willing to get involved in some of the business, or as you say, the Algerian colloquial, the business of the trafficking? That remains to be seen. That's another question. If they do, I think that's another quantum leap. Finally, the question is the interpenetration of the various trafficking cartels and AQIM. There is evidence of that. Just to throw just one data set out there, you may recall Christmas 2007, the French family, that picnicking French family that was killed in Mauritania. And the fellow who, the AQIM operative who carried out that attack, Abu Jendel. What was interesting was where the French intelligence finally caught up with him was in Guinea-Bissau, along with another character, Oud Sidi, a.k.a. Abu Sulema. They were both caught in Guinea-Bissau in a narco-trafficker's safe house. That to me is a significant bit of data, because clearly AQIM had enough operational ties with the narco-traffickers to exfiltrate their operatives who were being sought using the routes used by the traffickers, and they certainly the traffickers had enough trust in them to let them into their safe houses. You don't just open your safe houses, one can imagine, to just anyone. So how that develops, I think, is an open question in the coming years, one that leads to another, quote unquote, if you will, foreign element into this equation. So with that, I'll stop and listen to my fellow panelists and welcome your questions. Thank you.
Yeah, want to begin?
Well, thank you, Peter. That was very interesting, and thank you also to Michael Noonan for organizing this. I'm going to start by just putting my own bottom line up front analysis of the situation, which is that regional foreign fighter incidence is on the rise in the Maghreb. And what I mean by that is that increasing numbers of fighters from states in Africa are participating with AQIM activities. And I think the reason for that, it's important to keep this reason in context, which is that AQIM has needed to expand its activities into the Sahel because it's been unable to recruit in Algeria. It is suffering from low recruitment numbers in what would normally be its natural audience, which would be the other North African states. So AQIM's inability to sustain itself through recruitment from Algeria, its inability to make any inroads in recruitment, significant inroads from Morocco and Tunisia, and the lack of a substantive partner, a substantive operationally capable partner in Libya right now, has forced the group to look elsewhere. But what this has done is given AQIM an increased ability to diversify its area of operations, although GSPC and GIA were active in the Sahel, as Peter noted. AQIM's increased cooperation with fighters who are from Mauritania, from Mali, from Niger, has allowed them to expand their support networks. And this is a really important point that Peter touched on quite a bit with his conversation or his discussion of the criminal networks. Developing these additional facilitation networks, additional support networks, and additional avenues of support, be that social support for recruitment, be that a bit of financial support, be that sympathetic government officials who might be turning away to certain activities. That, I think, is one of the critical things that AQIM is gaining from these fighters. And going forward, this incidence of regional foreign fighters, I think it is a threat to regional security. AQIM is not in a position to destabilize any of the states in the region. Nonetheless, it's a worrying fact that they are able to draw these additional populations. What it suggests is that there's a need for greater regional cooperation, and Mr. Ford was providing us some insight this morning on some of the activities that are going on and U.S. efforts to support that regional coordination. But to the extent that AQIM diversifies its the source origins of its fighters, that regional cooperation is increasingly necessary to solve the problem. The kidnapping is an ongoing nuisance. It's likely to get worse, and quite honestly, it's a matter of concern for U.S. officials who are working and traveling in the region, as well as NGOs. There's a great number of American citizens in the Sahel, and AQIM is certainly looking for them. We know that they buy hostages, and we know that these networks are quite capable of finding foreigners, even in what look like fairly safe locations, as was evidenced by the kidnapping in Arlit. One other point that I wanted to bring up, just to add a little bit more context, is looking at the effect of Iraq and Afghanistan and the transfer of ideology and TTPs from those theaters back to North Africa. And I think what's clear is the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan serve to socialize a young generation of potential recruits, both in North Africa and in the Sahel states, making them perhaps more susceptible to AQIM's recruitment messages, having seen these conflicts elsewhere where there were where fighters were going to join these other organizations. As far as the transfer of TTPs, we did see a change in AQIM's behavior at the time of their alignment with al-Qaeda. It's in some ways, we need to differentiate that somewhat from the possible incidence of foreign fighters. Some of you may have seen an interview in July 2008. The Amir of AQIM, Drukdal, gave an interview with the New York Times in which he said that there were only a handful of fighters who had spent time in Iraq that came back to North Africa. For open sources, we may want to take his word for that. But some of the tactics, one of the interesting things is that some of the tactics that are associated with foreign fighters, suicide attacks, VBIEDs, those have taken place in the northern part of Algeria. The operational units that are close to Algiers itself in the stronghold of Kabylia, as Peter mentioned. That is where the suicide attacks have been taking place, with the exception of 1 or 2 incidents in Mauritania that I don't think quite fit the pattern. So what we associate with foreign fighters, again, VBIEDs, mass casualty attacks, suicide operations, entirely taking place in the north of the country. And those are the units of AQIM that have the least amount of diversity. I can't say with any certainty that there are no regional foreign fighters in those units, but those are the most Algerian of the units. Whereas the units in the Sahel, in the former Zone 9, in the south of the country, the ones that are operating in Mali and Mauritania, and increasingly in Niger, those are the units that have recruits from those countries. Those are the units where you see more criminal activity taking place. Certainly they're more in the mold of a guerrilla fighter than what we think of as a quote-unquote foreign fighter seeking martyrdom. It's a very important difference to keep in mind as we look at the way that the group functions across the different regions. What that suggests, though, is that those foreign fighters, since they're the foreign regional fighters that are active in the Sahel, since they do not appear to be seeking martyrdom, they're participating for other reasons. And their utility to the organization, their utility to AQIM, may derive more from their social, tribal, or in fact their criminal connections. So their utility to the organization may be the populations that they come from. Again, be that tribe or be that I know someone who knows a smuggler and so forth. But one of the, if there is a silver lining to any of this, it's that the criminal activity, I think, gives the United States an interesting angle to increase its collaboration in the area. Whereas there's a lot of states in Africa and elsewhere that are nervous about public reaction to U.S. involvement or an appearance of U.S. military involvement in their countries. When you talk about attacking a criminal problem, that may be more acceptable for the countries in the region and for their domestic populations, for their domestic concerns. If we say, we're going to help you get rid of these awful drug smugglers, that may have a different kind of appeal or may find a broader support. And I'll leave it there.
I think Audra will speak next.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Peter, for a great paper, and thanks to Michael Noonan for inviting me, and to all of you for coming out today. I'm going to echo a few of Lianne's comments regarding the composition of AQIM, but also talk about the local context and its impact on foreign fighters and foreign fighter recruitment. But yes, indeed, AQIM or AQIM is comprised mostly of Algerians and has substantially fewer Moroccans, Libyans, and Tunisians. And I mean, this is partly due to effective counterterrorism efforts in those countries, but also to weaknesses in the jihadi movements in these countries, either due to the position of important political structures such as the Moroccan monarchy, which is the most important political and religious authority in that country, and also policies of inclusion in Morocco, but also in Libya and Tunisia, more coercive efforts, which have substantially weakened those movements in those countries, and also, as was said earlier, similar efforts in Algeria, which has weakened AQIM as well. The organization has had more success, however, in extending its outreach to the Sahel, particularly Mauritania and Mali. The organization has targeted military and government targets and tourists in Mauritania with Mauritanian assistance, has also launched attacks and kidnappings in Mali. It's killed military officers there. And it's also the place where the murder of British tourist Ed Dwyer took place. There have also been numerous kidnappings of other EU tourists. And as recently in Niger this month, the organization kidnapped, as was stated earlier, 5 Frenchmen and also 2 Africans in a remote mining area. And in July, murdered a French worker. I think, as Dr. Pham said earlier, this involvement in kidnappings for ransom suggests that AQIM is indeed increasingly involved in using crime as a mechanism for exchange, given that al-Qaeda is not giving it any funds. So this is also a way for the organization to raise revenue. One of the things I want to talk about are the sorts of conditions that have made this sort of activity permissive, particularly in the Sahel region, which is where al-Qaeda, again, has had more success in extending its outreach. The region has huge swaths of remote, difficult-to-govern territory. Mauritania, southern Algeria, northern Mali, and Niger. They're not very hospitable areas. It's difficult for the government and law enforcement and military forces to reach. The government also has limited reach in these areas in terms of the amount of attention that it pays to infrastructure. So as far as law enforcement is concerned and efforts to monitor porous borders, it's very difficult, which means that it's very easy to move humans, goods, and funds in these particular regions. Aiding this is the availability of ancient caravan routes, which are used for smuggling and illicit trade activity, which is a dynamic that Peter Pham also made reference to just a few minutes ago. However, there are significant economic and political conditions that also provide for an available pool of potential foreign fighter recruits. Illiteracy is very high. Economic performance is very poor, creating significant disparities in these countries. Political structures are weak, plagued by corruption, and in some cases very unstable. I'm talking here about Mauritania specifically, which has had multiple coups alone since 1991. And it, like many of its Sahelian neighbors, is characterized by societal divisions that are very deep, pervasive, and wholly unreconciled. And I think what this means is that we're talking about populations that are alienated from their governments and disaffected. And this has implications for the government's ability to engage in certain segments of the population because there's just a great deal of apprehension and I think a lack of trust. And on the whole, populations in the Sahelian countries do not sympathize with extremist Islam, and that's true. But what I think is potentially problematic and what does have an impact on this phenomena is that the moderate trends that tend to characterize the practice of Islam there stand in uneasy tension, I think, with more extremist currents that have spread over the years. And by this, I'm talking about the Salafi jihadi trends that have been brought by external actors. So I think in terms of impact, the ability of the organization to extend its reach in the Sahel contributes to its ability to sustain network operations. It also presents some kind of threat to US forces and European forces abroad. Whether the group will actually be able to mount significant insurgency and topple governments, of course, is a huge open-ended question, I think. But I think what is also constraining AQIM efforts is that counterterrorism strategies in regional and international cooperation have improved the effect of constraining the organization's efforts. Transit has become more difficult between borders. Travel from Algeria to Mauritania, for example, is much more difficult. And the borders between Morocco and Algeria have long been closed. That's always been a circumstance. But it makes for difficult movement among people in this area. Excuse me. Also, in terms of the terrain itself, we're not talking about areas that are very nice to be in. So you're talking about very hot desert regions that are not very pleasant to hang around in. So that's, I think, is a deterrent as well. I was also asked to comment on the impact of the return of Afghan Arabs that fought in Afghanistan during the 1980s, among a couple of other things. And I think it was mentioned earlier in previous presentations that they did have the impact of returning to the Maghreb region and radicalizing Islamist movements there. But in terms of looking at specifically the North African fighters who returned from Afghanistan or who fought in Afghanistan, the Sinjar reports found that although a significant number of those foreign fighters were from North Africa, an alarming percentage were from Libya in particular. And that, I think that deserves some comment. They came specifically from two cities, Darna and Benghazi. For those of you who don't know about Libyan geography, these cities have in common that they're in the eastern provinces of the country. They're very poor. They have not typically received a great deal of government attention. But also, the provinces are of note because they are revered among local residents for their historic resistance and rebellion, being former sites of Islamist rebellion. But this only tells, I think, only part of the story why a significant number of Libyan fighters came from these two cities. Reporting also suggests that in terms of the experiences and in terms of the reasons why Libyan fighters from these cities went to Iraq, it's actually very diverse and very, very individual. So I think there's still a lot of research that needs to be done there in terms of why certain cities are attractive, but there do seem to be some common features in terms of why foreign fighters do tend to come from certain areas. Having said that, I think urban settings are important for playing a role in terms of foreign fighter recruitment. Clint Watts, who's here today, has pointed out that foreign fighters or former foreign fighter veterans return to cities to recruit, tapping into disaffection and a desire to defend the Muslim community and essentially to have a purpose. And I think that's very important because when you combine that with economic or with a dearth of economic opportunity, high levels of unemployment, anti-Western sentiment, frustration with governments, lack of political opportunity, all of those grievances are channeled somewhere and they're given purpose through these veterans who glorify their experiences in theaters abroad. So they play a role as well. I will not discount the importance of the internet because I think the internet also has a function in radicalizing individuals who do end up becoming foreign fighters. And I think this was the case for those who went to Iraq, at least for some Maghrebi countries. So in terms of the impact, I don't know if we can conclude for certain that North Africans who have returned from Iraq in any case have contributed significantly to AQIM's sustainability or sustained operations. But as Lianne said, the fact that we are seeing sophistication or growing sophistication of operations in terms of the use of IEDs suggests that there is a benefit from the knowledge of returned veterans. So there may indeed be an impact, but to what extent it is a significant impact, I think, without knowing how many numbers or how many people have returned, we really can't say for sure. But there do seem to be indications that they do have an impact in terms of the organization's operational sophistication. And so I think with that, I will close here and turn it over to John Entelis.
Thank you. Without overlapping with previous presenters, what I'd like to do here is provide a kind of balance sheet on the relationship between the GPS, the Salafist group for preaching and combat, and its new incarnation as AQIM. Interestingly enough, it's an Algerian scholar in Algeria who presented as such a balance sheet. One would think that it'd be very difficult to be discussing this topic in Algiers by an Algerian academic. But I thought his assessment was pretty much on the money. So I'm basically going to summarize some of his conclusions and then add my own in determining what ultimately is the bottom line of this relationship. There are positive and negative factors. There is the view that AQIM in its new manifestation is a manifestation of decline, not a manifestation of strength or empowerment. And 5 factors are identified along these lines. One begins with the national reconciliation that Bouteflika has promoted and was applied throughout the nation, and has resulted in more and more jihadists turning themselves in, best represented by the defection of the founder of the GSPC, Hassan Hattab himself, who has now become a spokesman for the government, inviting jihadists to give up the struggle and to reintegrate peacefully into Algeria. Additionally, it is noted that the Algerian army has been relatively successful in hunting down insurgents in border regions with Mali and Libya, as well as in the mountainous areas of eastern Algeria, of Kabylia, that has been mentioned. The rebels' traditional strongholds of operation have been reduced, thereby limiting their freedom of movement. Meanwhile, the repentant former militants have turned into informants par excellence, with the detailed field information they are providing to the intelligence agencies, threatening the entire organization. Their tips have been behind most of the successful raids launched by the Algerian security forces, especially after 10 Tunisian activists were arrested on their way to the Algerian mountains to receive military training, which reinforced the impression that AQIM could be infiltrated. The withdrawal of the Libya's Islamic Combat Group from AQIM, because AQIM, remember, integrated the Libyan, the Tunisian, the Moroccan, and the Algerians. The Libyans have pulled out. They pulled out in 2009. Another indication that AQIM is weakening. So that's the first of the explanations of AQIM actually weakening, not strengthening. The second one is the successive splits within AQIM. The reconciliation process has formed divisions among AQIM fighters on whether or not members should accept the government's amnesty offer. Hattab has been particularly vocal in calling for AQIM members to lay down their arms. Attempts by AQIM leader Drukdal to provide religious justification for suicide attacks, which has been mentioned is a relatively new tactic phenomenon in the Algerian context. Drukdal, again, who is the head of AQIM, to provide religious justification for suicide attacks, have met with failure, as jihadist Mufti Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi declared suicide attacks to be illegal from a religious standpoint, an exchange of letters between the two men, as reported in the Algerian newspaper Ash-Shuruk. Second of these weaknesses. A third is the stance towards the parent organization. The division between local focused objectives and more global ones still persists, as certain GSPC members resent having been reduced to mere agents of al-Qaeda. Others believe that GSPC has witnessed many deviations, quote unquote, since joining AQIM, and has become involved in burglary, kidnapping, and other, quote, criminal activities that have cost the lives of innocent civilians. One important factor that first led GSPC to break away from the GIA. The GIA was, among its hallmarks, was its attack against civilians and villagers, as well as military. And GSPC emerged in part to respond to that, directing its attack on military targets and the intelligence service and the police. So there's this disconnect and this dissatisfaction among the more purist, the locally inspired Algerian fighters of having to incorporate these deviationary tactics that al-Qaeda is imposing. To compensate for this possible loss of support, it is believed that AQIM undertook several spectacular headline-grabbing operations with 3 distinct features: suicide attacks, focusing on cities instead of the mountains, and targeting key government and international institutions, such as the headquarters of the Constitutional Council, and the Supreme Court and the UN headquarters are all located in the El-Biar section of Algiers, which is one of the fancier parts of the city. This is where also El-Biar and and that area is where the diplomatic residencies are, along with other government buildings. So this attack, which took place on December 11th, it was mentioned earlier, 2007, left scores dead and wounded. Now, Drukgyal himself insisted in this New York interview that has been mentioned a couple of times, that all those who were killed, quote, were government agents, including those dressed in civilian clothing. And fourthly, there are intellectual figures who are challenging the legitimacy of AQIM, including someone like Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, also known as Dr. Fadl, who is recognized as one of the intellectual sources of al-Qaeda's philosophy, has recanted his original beliefs and declared GSPC's jihad to be illegitimate. This has caused consternation among GSPC members, especially a newer and younger generation that sees opportunism rather than principles guiding the recruiting of gullible youth who are lured with offers of money and sent out to Iraq to gain battlefield experience in preparation for their return to the Maghreb, as we've all familiar with. Finally, the fifth and last point that's been pointed out about the weakness in AQIM is, as has been commented, the changing international stance and shrinking sources of aid. Since September 11th, the global response to terrorism has seriously interrupted operations, including the sources of funding, which of course can help explain this wave of kidnapping and ransom that is to make up for this loss. The regular arrest in Europe and elsewhere of jihadists from North Africa or those of Maghrebi origins and living in Europe testifies to the disruptive impact such global coordination of anti-terrorist efforts are having on domestic groups. So these are five. I mean, one could identify more. However, on the other side, there is counter-argument. It's again, five or so in nature, that say that this alliance is beneficial, and that there are domestic and regional factors that will keep AQIM active, if not further strengthened. First of all, is the absence of political freedoms. Now, most of today has been narrowly focused on operational security, military concerns. As a political scientist, if to me there's a bottom line, clearly in the case of North Africa, it is the political context within which all of this takes place, however much the particular strategies or tactics that are used to justify or not these political conditions. But clearly the absence of political freedoms, as long as that continues, there's always the possibility, there's always the hope, even though AQIM, we've been told over and over again, is not interested about the local context, the regional context. It doesn't care if it alienates people. It can recruit from anywhere and anyhow. The fact of the matter, however, this condition of the absence of political freedoms always provides a pool of potential recruits that range across the whole of the region, since there's not a single politically free country in North Africa. More than any other single factor, the absence of meaningful political participation, freedoms, and opportunities in the Maghreb continues to exacerbate state-society relations, creating an enormous chasm through which thousands of disaffected youth, many young, unemployed or underemployed males, seething with anger and frustration, fall through. Despite the multitude of challenges ruling elites have experienced these many years, they seem unwilling or unable to foster a democratic transformation that would create genuine representation and the peaceful transfer of power, turning political Islam into a normal component of modern civil society. The opportunity for democratic reforms, we can go back to the period of feasts in the 1990s. This is where Algeria became probably the only Arab state that underwent a very short period of genuine, transparent, authentic democratic transformation. The fact that that opportunity was undercut by the military still resonates among many Algerians. In using Western backing for the war on terror, incumbent regimes have further justified increased repression that in turn makes jihadist alternatives that much more appealing. Even if they are not able to recruit to the same extent they did in the past, you don't need that many people to engage in the kind of activity that they are engaged in. We've heard over and over again percentages and how many you need and how many you don't need. So when one talks about a discontented youthful class, how many of those do you really need to make a difference in terms of recruiting for terrorist activity? If a hopeless socioeconomic environment doesn't serve to attract frustrated youth towards violent action, prison time, including torture, surely does. The combination of a robust domestic authoritarianism and military support from overseas, whether direct or indirect, in the name of defeating terrorism, simply reinforces rather than diminishes regime repression that subsequently fuels support for AQIM. This is one of the arguments. Again, this is an attempt to provide a kind of cost-benefit analysis of the positive-negative sides to this fusion that is now AQIM. The second argument that this will continue for in the future is the crisis itself in civil society. And throughout North Africa. Under conditions of martial law, limited political pluralism, absence of civil liberties, and the rule of law, the ability of civil society to serve as the zone of citizen participation and organization has been severely reduced. Algerian civil society regularly erupts into violence, chaos, wildcat strikes, and large-scale demonstrations and protests against declining living standards and a compromised quality of life, at the same time that the state coffers are overflowing with hydrocarbon-generated revenues. I was talking earlier about how do you turn these jihadists from being heroes into villains, and to sort of profile them and make it clear to the society as a whole that these are criminals and so on and so forth. What one doesn't realize is most people in that society view their government as criminals. So you're having a hard time to profile and try to make villains out of people who are viewed by comparison to the real villains, the state and its regime, as the ones who are really the source of the problems. Unlike what the regime seeks to portray, those involved in such street protests are less concerned with jihadism and AQIM than acquire a better job, housing, and so forth. Yet when regime response is more rather than less repression, AQIM's appeal seems no longer so far-fetched. With civil society atrophied and without any effective role for intermediary institutions like genuinely independent and representative political parties, the conflict in Algeria and beyond has been reduced to that of one between state security services and armed militias of AQIM. The third condition that enhances AQIM's position: instability overall. The Maghreb, including the whole Sahelian corridor, is a region of instability and conflict, with the Western Sahara, which is interesting that has not been mentioned, as a real source of dispute, and Tuareg insurrections in northern Mali and Niger, creating favorable environment for AQIM to expand its recruiting, smuggling, and other activities. Here's the talk about collaboration, which I guess is the fourth point. Which let me make that and then make my point about how the conflict in the Western Sahara makes the attack against or trying to eliminate terrorism in North Africa so much more difficult. The fourth element is the weak regional cooperation. We talk about AFRICOM. AFRICOM works with whom? It works with countries that distrust each other enormously. Morocco and Algeria have a border that's been closed for over 10 years. The Sahara dispute poisons the atmosphere. It's hard to believe that under those conditions they're willing partners, whether intelligence or otherwise, to provide the kind of information that would make a difference in combating terrorism. Despite the U.S.-sponsored Trans-Saharan Counterterrorism Partnership and its predecessor, the Pan-Sahel Initiative, intended to organize region-wide activities of both a military and developmental nature, the region remains highly fragmented, with the Ummah, the Union Maghrébine Arabe, that was founded in 1989, a virtual meaningless region-wide organization. Even the intelligence gathering activities sponsored by the U.S. is highly compromised by the unwillingness of individual countries, especially Algeria and Morocco, who are the two key actors in the region, to divulge sensitive intelligence data that each country believes could be used against its own national interests. Given this environment of mistrust and duplicity, it is not surprising that more conspiracy-minded analysts believe that the Algerian regime is itself implicated in terrorist activity in order to justify continued military and intelligence support from key outside actors like France and the U.S. And there are colleagues, Peter and I know very well, Jeremy Keenan, who sincerely believes, and someone who's spent many years in the Sahara, that AQIM itself, the GSPC, the GIA, AIS, all the previous organizations were one way or another agents of the Algerian security services, with the intention of creating a divide and rule situation that enhances their ability to maintain themselves in power in the face of a discontented civil society. Finally, the social and economic conditions. As discussed above, poor socioeconomic opportunities, whether real or imagined, have created a large pool of discontented young people. A youth who takes to the mountains with AQIM and who could blow himself up to enter heaven within 30 seconds, as promised by the organization, is essentially no different from a young man desperately risking his life trying to cross the Mediterranean on a flimsy boat in an attempt to reach the promised lands of a northern shore. Why don't I stop at this point and use the occasion for discussion? Thank you.
Peter, would you like to respond?
Well, I thank the panelists for their thoughtful comments. I think we're all pretty much in agreement on that. And I would just pick up on a theme that John just mentioned. It's really in the interest of, we've in the last few days, as the latest hostage taking is taking place, there's been a lot of talk about how the U.S. and France are cooperating. The French president asked for U.S. assistance, et cetera. But one of the things I think both countries and the international community could really do is move on this issue of encouraging regional cooperation. We can't get people to attend the same meetings, et cetera. As you said, the Arab Maghreb Union has been inactive for, a decade and a half now at least. That we really need that type of coordination, without which we leave a huge gap for which this can operate. And I think that should be maybe a strategic political priority of the region's partners overseas to try to nudge that along.
Did any other panelists have anything to add from something else that was said? No? Is there any questions in the audience? Please come to the microphone if there are. Here we go.
It seems like it's come up across all the panelists that some degree of criminality, the fact that there's a lot of bartering going on between different groups, and whether they're 100% for al-Qaeda or if they're part of a sort of a regional insurgency. And I wondered if anybody has really approached this from an organized crime model, because that's essentially how law enforcement, if this was Italian mafia or Irish organized crime, from different periods, they would look at it and say, well, this group would be pretty vulnerable to being either one, bought the other direction. So instead of paying for kidnappings, we, pay for, foreign fighters that are flowing through there. The other one is, it would seem that they're very, vulnerable to double agents, other sorts of operations like that, which Algeria has been known for, as you just brought up, for decades. So I just wondered what your guys' thoughts were in terms of a strategy. We've talked a lot about cooperation, but there's a lot of weaknesses in cooperation, especially when you have a lot of weak militaries and weak government structures, about tackling it more as a task force problem and organized crime perspective. Just wonder what people's thoughts were.
Well, I think you raised several good points. I think the crime nexus, it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, the groups that, especially the extremist groups, which are our primary concern, that cooperate with criminal elements, certainly open themselves up to being caught that way. But it also, the way at least that AQIM has been using the crime groups so far actually protects it. Because they're hiring someone, if they send someone out, if you carry out an operation on your own to kidnap someone and it fails, and the Mauritanians, who actually have been relatively robust, capture you, then if they've got someone from the inside. In the case of the Spanish hostages, they rolled up no one from AQIM. They were all this one guy, Omar Lasharawi Udahama, who was rolled up, and then the people they brought to trial with him were all an ad hoc gang he put together. They didn't catch one real AQIM person, so it cuts both ways. But I think the point is well taken. But I think some of the same problems that would affect the current military cooperation, counterterrorism cooperation, also affect the cooperation on criminal matters on joint task force. Below the surface, there have been back and forth Mali and Mauritania have been they haven't been at each other's throats in the way Algeria and Morocco have been, but the Mauritanians have certainly taken a more robust approach, the Malians a more lax approach, and they've gotten a little angry that when the Mauritanians have continued pursuit onto national territory, even though they haven't. So there is tension that. So I think some of the same issues would be there, but certainly I think the approach, and also it becomes the final point would be a matter of getting the expertise out there. For example, in some of these areas, Guinea-Bissau, which I mentioned, we don't even have an embassy, much less a legat or anyone else to coordinate. So we have to just kind of step up on that issue. Also, we have to also look, and we've been unwilling because we look for our success stories. I think the point was well taken from an earlier panel that out in the middle of the desert, not exactly the best place to run criminal enterprise. So you need a certain infrastructure. I fully agree, but the certain infrastructure also does exist. But there are sort of, let me name some countries, Senegal, Gambia. So that's where the infrastructure is. That's where Gambia, look at all the banking and the money that passes through there, plus the drug bust. Senegal, we're holding it up, I think a big mistake, as one of our Millennium Challenge poster children, even while the president's building a $70 million, built a $70 million statue built by the North Koreans. But we're so desperate for a success that we don't want to talk about, any sort of thing. So we're not going to look that's where, there's the infrastructure right there for your nexus, but we don't want to talk about it because we need a success. The Africa Center for Strategic Studies has its little francophone operation there, so we don't want to jeopardize that. So we're not going to talk about how that regime is actually pretty much enabling a lot of this trafficking. So I think part of it is political will on our part too. I'll stop there.
I would only echo Peter's point about the lack of capacity on the ground. I think there may have been two parts to your question. One would be whether an analytical approach as an organized crime model would be useful, and I think it very much would be if we had all the appropriate data, perhaps someone does, to understand the different networks and how they're linking up or not linking up. Mm-hmm. I think as an approach, as a policy response, it would be very useful, but again, you get into capability problems with the states on the ground. And the ability to transfer the appropriate skills to the partner countries to attack it from that standpoint.
And I'd also like to just kind of dovetail off of what Lianne just said, and it mirrors what I was going to say just a few seconds before she jumped in. And it's in terms of an approach, you have to acknowledge that you're not just talking about one sort of network. I mean, these networks are nested within other networks. So in terms of smuggling, you also have to consider drug trade, arms trade, trade in commodities, human trafficking, all of it. And it's a very complex network of illicit activity. In order to deal with one node of that, you kind of have to deal with multiple nodes of it. And that involves dealing with countries where those nodes are more prominent, or individuals or organizations involved in those nodes are more prominent. So it takes not just, I think, a broader conceptualization of what these networks are, but also a realization that it's going to involve more than 1, 2, 3, 4, or even 5 countries, but probably a dozen or more countries, because the networks, I think, are that vast and that complex. And you're not dealing with one organization, you're dealing with several organizations, or you might be dealing with just one person. And I think that's probably one of the misconceptions that we have about networks, is that we're often dealing with, or we think we're dealing with, a discrete or concrete or coherent organization. And often you're dealing with one or two individuals or a group of individuals who happen to get together to carry out one operation, and then they go away and disperse and come together and crop up somewhere else. So you're dealing with very complex and fluid sorts of activity. And I think conceptually or intellectually, we have to be able to frame that and then go after it.
Well, I think, the U.S., either way, whether it's looking at it as a criminal enterprise or as a terrorist challenge, from the perspective of North Africans, most people perceive, whether or not it's true, that whatever criminal activity is taking place, their governments are engaged in it, one way or another. At what level, they're not sure, but they believe that. Secondly, they don't see the terrorist threat in the way that we've defined it, most average people. Now, so therefore, to what extent does U.S. military involvement or let's say police, judicial involvement in trying to say, stop the criminality or stop the terrorism, to what extent does it fuel these misperceptions and divisions, or does it actually, solve them? And it seems to me that it could go either way, and that the idea of cooperating, for example, with Algerian or North African intelligence and military services, which by the way, most North Africans are not informed about. I mean, when General Ward would stop over and see Bouteflika, that would be the Bouteflika profile. So the Algerians themselves are not being informed exactly what we're involved in. So their imagination, their conspiracy-oriented nature, then goes every which way. So the government doesn't, provide full details what the U.S. is actually doing in cooperation with the Algerians. So this makes it even that much more difficult. So I would really rethink the degree of involvement in the absence of a greater transparency and clarification on the part of the regimes towards their own society, and even just providing information, and let that information be the basis for people to judge whether they think it's really necessary or not. And secondly, to really, clean up your house, and then we'll come in and we'll start helping. Maybe it's easy enough for an academic to say it, and I know there are a lot of investments related to it, but I think the Europeans have much more of an investment in this than we do, and they should be pushing these countries to clean up their act, which they're not, namely the French. So I see this as a kind of vicious circle that we will not get out of anytime soon.
Please.
I'm actually least familiar with Maghreb, but I think I could see the same patterns that you would see in Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia for that matter. And that is the issue of tribes and clans. I have this hypothesis that somehow all Western policy, in particular US policy, towards fighting terrorism is geared in a paradigm that we deal with countries and nations, whereas al-Qaeda's ideology diffuses through the medium of clan or tribes. And so what would you say to that? I mean, is the issue, you pointed out society that's not happy, the eastern two cities that you mentioned. How much is the clan or the tribal issue is an issue? Starting from Algeria, the issue of Berbers, the Tuaregs. Please talk to that.
Anyone?
Well, I think it's an important factor that has to be factored into the analysis. Certainly, and it's certainly one of the things that can be exploited. For example, there have been long-standing tensions. The Tuareg rebellion just ended, but less than 2 years ago in Niger, and the main bone of contention was marginalization, lack of revenue sharing from all these uranium concessions that are being let out. So, and that sense of identity. So it's a social reality. And I think that has to be factored in. Do we often fall by default into a state-centric model? I think it's an inevitable, and I'm not justifying it, but it is an inevitable occurrence in diplomacy. Diplomats look for other diplomats to talk to. But it's not.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think the response is tribal. I mean, Peter just said it. I mean, the tourism is no longer there. They're suffering economically. If the state was providing them with opportunities that they once had in the area, the tribal and ethnic card is usually played to mask economic and social grievances, not the other way around. Even in the Kabyle area, where the Berbers have been pushing for a long time for cultural and linguistic identity, but the other part of it is the degree to which they've been suffering economically, especially in their ability to go to France and get jobs, which is most of the Algerians in France are from the Kabyle. They're Berbers and they're fluent in French and that. So I'd be careful about privileging ethnicity, tribe, clan over social, economic, and political, grievances. Maybe that's my bias, but I'd be careful.
Does the social issues follow clan lines as a disparity?
Well, in light of this terrorist thing, for example, we know from the Sinjar files, El Wed, who I don't know if anyone's been to El Wed, it's a town I've spent a month in, which is an oasis village in the east, which had a high percentage of people that went over to Iraq, and I was really fascinated as to why it was the case. And I guess from what I've been hearing, it's a lot of social networking. But I don't think I don't think it was tribal. I just think it was family members and other social networks that came from El Wed, which is no reason in the world why one would think an oasis town in the Sahara in the eastern part of Algeria would be a recruiting center, because then you find them, you know, from Algiers and then from Tamarasset and so forth. So I would be cautious about overemphasizing the tribal or ethnic identity in regard to these kinds of political outcomes.
Yeah, and I think Peter made reference, or someone, maybe one of my panelists, made reference to the Tuareg cooperating with AQIM in smuggling activities, but I think it's because of economic interests. I don't think it's because the Tuareg are trying to, you know, poke their fingers in the eyes of Niger or Mali, where they are significant populations, but also disenfranchised and marginalized. I think it's because of economic interests, and as Peter said, the rebellion has ended. And I think they've also agreed to cooperate with the security forces. So that could translate into some kind of action against AQIM in those areas. So I think it's more interest-based than it is just based solely along tribal lines and identity. And you know, I think another open question is whether or not, you know, there'll be some kind of evolution or evolvement or emergence of some kind of, you know, Tuareg transnational identity in that region. I think that's another open-ended question, and that's something that people also ask in this regard, also with respect to their disenfranchisement throughout the Sahelian region.
I would just add to that 2 points. One is I agree with my co-panelists. AQIM's activities in the Sahel have caused economic harm to some of the disadvantaged populations in the Sahel, which would be the Tuareg, the Berbish, and so on. Those groups which have grievances against their states are being harmed by the loss of the tourism income and so forth from AQIM's activities. So there's not particularly an incentive for them to cooperate with it. In Morocco as well, the recruitment, I would say, has been from economically disadvantaged populations. And AQIM itself has, to my knowledge, and I follow their communications fairly closely, has not made an ethnic-based argument for participation. Their outreach has been based on fellow Muslims who are suffering at the hands of their states, which are puppets of Western interests. So their own messaging has not tapped into any of the potential fault lines within the region based on ethnicity.
Right. I mean, even among the Sahrawi in that area in Western Sahara, there's no desire to establish an Islamic state or a caliphate. I mean, that's just not what they want, and that's not what the Tuareg want either. So. As Lianne said, I just don't see that kind of traction taking hold there.
Yeah. Let me just add one final. I mean, I'll be the first to criticize us when we're, as a nation, when we're wrong or when we fail to get something. But we also shouldn't fall into the trap of self-flagellation. We're not the only ones who make mistakes on this. For example, AQIM has made, I think, earlier this summer, one of the two Katiba acting south, the one led by Abu Zaid. Abu Zaid made I think, time will tell, but I think a fatal error in starting a blood feud with the Tuareg for no apparent. Well, he was upset with a colonel in the Malian special forces couldn't get at him, so killed his brother instead. That type of thing doesn't engender, unlike someone like Belmokhtar, who went out of his way to demographically pick his wives to embed himself in the community. That's one approach, but then just because he gets it right doesn't mean that another AQIM leader gets it right, because the other one clearly, I think, made a mistake. Time will tell. So we're not the only ones who make mistakes. So.
Yeah, I didn't want to. I'm glad you mentioned that. No, if anything, I'm putting it in a positive light, saying that America's financial, human, military interests are not, helped by pursuing these policies. So it's to escape the problems, escape the criticism, rather than saying that. I understand why we do it, but I'm saying I think it's counterproductive, and if we're seriously debating what we should do in this area, I think we should really reconsider the commitments we're making in the absence of commitments on the parts of our so-called partners who are not. I don't know what we're asking of them, but they're not doing anything. We're the ones that are sacrificing financially, militarily, and intelligence. They say I don't see any democratization. I don't see accountability. I don't see transparency. I wouldn't trust their, whatever intelligence they're sharing, because of the reasons I've indicated, given the regional conflicts and so on and so forth. So it's more in a positive way than a negative. I think Lauren had a question over there.
Actually, if I can just ask Alan first, do we have any questions from the? And I'll get you right after this, okay?
Although this person is not identifiable. Although one can make an argument that AQIM is weakening, they still have decent support in northern Mali. Perhaps they are one spectacular attack away from being a very credible organization, which could sway tribal allegiances, increase foreign fighter devotees, and strengthen the organization. How concerned are we about this potential? Do we see a tie-in with other organizations? What impact might Sudan, post-secession, have on the movement?
Anyone like?
Well, I don't know who said it earlier, but there was a comment to the effect that the North African states, maybe it was you, Lianne, are not threatened by AQIM from a national security. But on the question of countries like Mauritania, or even Mali and Niger, I do think these countries are susceptible to a great deal of instability. Whether they'll be in next Somalia or something else, but witnessing what's going on in Mauritania, the instability in the government, democratically elected government, coup d'état, closing down of much of the democratic process, the ability of AQIM to sort of, operate pretty freely in the country, the size of the place. It just goes on and on. I'm not worried about Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, or Libya, but one could be concerned about Mauritania, Mali, Niger, and Chad, for that matter.
I want to thank everyone for a really interesting panel, although the day in general was quite informative. One of the things I'm left with is always in the European or European American context, sort of a dearth of coverage of history. I don't know why in academic circles, probably because of just the lack of multidisciplinary studies, that you don't dive into some of these historical, connections to what's happening now. So I was hoping that we could touch on that, both for Somalia, but didn't get a question in, but maybe for this region, because it seems like there's always an overlapping connection in these regions if you go back before most academics look at the contemporary situation. Is that the case in the Maghreb? Again, I'm asking the academic panel to enlighten us on whether there might be some historical precedents in terms of the connections or across some of these national lines. Because if we look at Afghanistan or Iraq, people dive into those discussions because the lines that the Europeans drew across these regions are always random. There might be parts of the globe where they weren't random, but most of the time they were random, and they put people together, and then they said, you are now Algeria. Welcome to my country. So I just wanted to get clarity, does that at all affect this region and this movement? And then finally, this lens, another lens I wanted to lay on for the day, maybe for tomorrow as well, is the role of women in understanding the dynamics for each of these regions. It was absent today. I was really saddened to see it. But the United States Institute of Peace has started a phenomenal array of studies. What they call it inclusive security, and there's an institute here that studies that. But that's basically trying to ask, what role do women play in these challenges of, these movements of terrorism or other names we could give them. And in particular, if you could answer if anyone has studied the role of women or the role gender plays or the effect that women have in these communities. If you haven't, you haven't, but I would be curious in this region if anyone has dived in it. If not, I'll go back to the Institute of Peace and ask them to look at the Maghreb. But they've basically found in Afghanistan and in the Middle East, there's a tremendous knowledge through women as they track their husbands, their cousins, their brothers, their neighbors, and have a very direct intelligence into what's going on in the community that gives access for all of us to know what's going on. So just be interested in your comments. Thank you.
Well, if we had maybe another 2 hours in advance, I would have loved to given you, as I do to my classes, the history of Algeria in the modern period, absolutely, extensively. And I fully agree with you that I was almost thinking to, starting, you named the point in time, but given the way this conference has been organized and the panels, that seemed like this was not the appropriate place to do it. But just simply to say, for those of us who study, research, publish, and teach the subject, as I have for many, many years, that's an absolutely essential part of the course, especially the colonial period, especially in the case of Algeria, especially the War of Independence, especially colonization, decolonization. Go see the Battle of Algiers, read Frantz Fanon, read Wretched of the Earth, read Lester Horne, Savage War of Peace. I mean, there are just some excellent, excellent books and movies that capture in extremely rich detail that history and beyond. So
do you think that's captured? Don't forget about the panel today, because you only have 2 hours.
Right.
Do you think in these debates and these discussions, at least that I attend around
Sure.
the Beltway, maybe in your classroom,
Sure.
it would be great if people around the Beltway were in your class, but for those of us who cover it for the U.S. federal government, contractors, are they getting that history?
No,
Do they factor that into their intelligence, their
It's-
analysis, and their reaction?
it's a very good,
For
yeah.
academics, probably in your institutions, you can take it on. What about us that work here and answer to the U.S. Congress, the U.S. executive branch?
No, I agree with you, but I gather it's a logistical question. It's a whole slew of just factors of time. But if any, and I've been involved in these kinds of panels in Washington for years. If any institute or any conference organizers ever asked me, so can you give us a little historical background, I'd be more than happy. But usually they have a particular agenda, a particular set of subjects, particular amount of time, and so it's very, very, very difficult. But I fully agree with what the statement you're making about the need for that as a starting point from which then the debate goes forward.
And for the purpose of this conversation, it would have been very nice if we, again, if there were room to talk about the evolution of Islamist movements in the Maghreb and some of the assumptions that we make regarding Sufi Islam, which is very important in that region, and the footprint of Sufi Islam, and some of the misconceptions that we have. Because if you look at Libyan history, the Senussi orders have actually had a very politically active role and a role in resistance in that country. So as far as our assumptions about Sufism being peaceful and all of that, they've actually been very active, and it differs across countries. So that's an important, I think, dimension to this as well. And regarding women, again, Algeria comes to mind. As you know, Algerian women were some of the biggest victims of the Algerian Civil War. And they were among the most vocal critics of the amnesty, because there was the argument that there wasn't an opportunity to actually name the perpetrators of the crime and not proper adjudication. Yes, exactly. So yeah, women do, I think, have a role in these dynamics as well, and it needs to be uncovered. But again, it's about time, and I think what the conference is focused on.
I would just agree wholeheartedly with you on the importance of the history, not just historical knowledge, but religious knowledge, legal knowledge. Like the whole argument over the Western Sahara is predicated on what happens with what is the meaning of the traditional allegiance, the bay'ah, to the Moroccan Sultan historically, how far it extended. That's without a knowledge of that, the Moroccan position is incomprehensible, and anyone else's position becomes. And so you're right, the history and also the trade patterns. And we look, the question from actually from the web, linking, if you're immersed in the region, the idea of linking Sudan with this region sounds odd, but actually, the whole phenomenon, just to cite an example, northern Nigeria, the reason that the Sharia movement in northern Nigeria has its roots in the pragmatic decision on the part of the British colonial government to send the Qadis to study in Sudan back when it was the Anglo-Egyptian condominium. And, well, their grandchildren are now going to the same schools, but, this isn't your grandfather's Omdurman anymore. It's the post. So the connections are still there. So all this history, culture, all that ties in.
I'll just add one example. To the point that we all need to understand the context better, AQIM does have a good understanding of historical context, and one of the things that they frequently do is reference successful revolutionary Islamic movements that have come out of the region. For example, the Al-Murabitun or the Almoravid dynasty in Morocco grew out of Mauritania, and it was a movement that was intended to purify Islam through war. And so that's a point of reference that AQIM often makes in its arguments and speeches, sort of calling this meta-historical narrative, this regional meta-narrative, to mind for folks that may have heard of it in some places. But so we are missing out. I agree with you.
Okay, I think we're gonna wrap it up there. Thank you very much, everyone, for the wonderful discussion. It was very enlightening. Tomorrow there will again begin around 8 o'clock with a panel on Yemen beginning at 8:45. And do you have anything else to add, Mike?
But it would have been good if we all had presented soon.
Well, the bagels. So. Okay. Thank you, everyone.